Hey guys, this is the second tutorial. This is the second bouncing ball tutorial that we're going to start here. We have a scene that's very similar. It looks a little different because I have the ball up here out of frame. And then I have the resolution gate on and the safe action gate on. So that's just a little bit of a different thing that we're dealing with there. And what we're going to do in this one is instead of just jumping up and down in the middle like we did with the first bouncing ball, what's going to happen is this one is going to bounce maybe 5 times and roll to a stop. So it's going to be a lot more of a linear kind of an action. And it's going to be a lot more based on just physics and gravity and not as much as just the ball bouncing on its own power. So let's go ahead and start out. I guess we can just start out at 200 frames, just how the default is, and we'll just see how it goes. So what's going to have to happen is a few things in this. You're going to have the ball moving in what looks like the z-axis, because we're going this way, and that's the way our ball is facing. So we have to move horizontally in the z-axis. It's also going to have to rotate as it bounces. So there's going to be a rotation on the x-axis, and then it's going to have to go some up and down bouncing on the y-axis. And then later on, we'll worry about the squashing and stretching and all of that. We'll do that later. But let's first just start out with just the movement horizontally. So I'm going to select my ball here. Let me get into my channel box. And I'm just going to key all of my translates right where they are. Probably I won't translate in the X at all, but we'll just put one there just to sort of pin it in place just in case. So I'm just going to key all those right there. And then we'll go down here to the end. And then what I'll do is I'll just take this, and on the Z-axis, I'll just move it to about, let's see, it's going to be about right there. And actually, it doesn't really matter on that because that's going to be, we're going to control that later. So, but we'll actually just, maybe we'll push it off to the side later. We'll just decide later on what to do with that. This will be fine for right now, just as a starting keyframe. And then I'll just set the same keyframes there. And then actually, let me just get rid of these two, and let's just start off with just keyframes in the Z-axis. I'll just break those connections. Anytime you want to get rid of animation while you're keyframing, if you want to take it out of a whole channel, that's how you do it. You just highlight the channel, right click, and go down to break connections right there, and then that will just get rid of all the keyframing in that channel. That's a pretty handy thing to know. So right now, let me just hit 6. Hopefully that'll bring up my texture. There we go. So now, if I play this, actually it's starting at the bottom, that's fine, but it's just moving across sort of in an even kind of a way. And that's fine. That's a good sort of start. This is just the first movement that we're doing from one side to the other, but it's still pretty even. So let's actually go up into our graph editor. Make friends with the graph editor because there's a lot of stuff that you can do in the graph editor that you really can't do any way else that's efficient or anything like that. So we have our simple little spline that you always have in the graph editor because they're spline tangents. So what we need to have happen is that we need this to sort of move fairly quickly at the beginning and then slow down at the end. So again, that slowing in and out that we talked about. And the way that you can make that happen is if I take this keyframe here, I can take this tangent and just sort of move it up like that. So it sort of slants more at the beginning and then flattens out at the end. What you should remember in the graph editor is the more vertical the line is, the faster the movement is. And then the more flat that it is, the slower the movement. That's really the best way to judge what this line actually means. So I'm just going to pull this up here like this so it makes this kind of an arc. And let's see what that did to our movement. I'll just play it again. See how much faster it is and then it starts to slow down. That's probably more like what we're going to need eventually. Once we get the bounces in, that's going to be a lot more like what we're looking for. So that's really pretty much all the keyframes that we're going to need on the Z-axis. So let's go ahead and go back to the beginning, and let's think about the X-axis. Now that's the rotation that we're going to need, rotating on the X-axis. So we'll start out like this, and let's just key it right there. Rotate X, we'll just key it. And then at the end, this little key here will jump from one keyframe to the next. So I could just click that, and it'll go to the next keyframe. If you put 360 in here, it will rotate around a total of 1 time. So, I mean, I suppose that's a good place to start. If you doubled that, it would rotate around twice. So let's actually just see how much that would be. Let me get my calculator out here, because this is math and I need a calculator. So 360 times 2, that's going to be 720. Let's start out with that. Let's put 720 here in the rotate X. And we'll key that there. And then this will rotate around twice from beginning to end. And again, we can go back and adjust this at any point if we want, if it feels like we need to. But we're just trying to get some basic keyframes in just to have something to start with. So now if I play this, let me get off of my move tool and my rotate and all that, and we can just see the ball, and I'll play it, and it's kind of starting to rotate and then rolling to a stop. So, but what's happening is if I go ahead and I can come up here in my graph editor and click A so I can see everything, we have that same kind of spline for our rotation, which is kind of not what we want, because again, we need for it to be moving more at the beginning and less at the end when it rolls to a stop. So we're just going to do the same thing. I'm going to take this first keyframe, take this tangent, and just turn it up so that it's kind of like an arc, like that. So it moves faster and then it slows down, slowing in and out. So now when we play this, you can see it kind of moves fast and then it slows down, and then it eventually rolls to a stop. It's a little bit slidey here at the beginning, but that's going to be fixed when we start to put the bounces in. So, but yeah, for now, that's probably good, be okay. Might have to make some adjustments as far as how far it goes while it's rolling, but we'll look at that later. So now we have those, and we need to go ahead and start working with the bounce. So I think it's probably going to be better if we start high and off frame, kind of like right here. So I'm going to put this ball back up here like this. And that's where we're going to start out with the translate Y. So I'll go ahead and key the translate Y right there. And then you kind of just have to guess how far you want to go down in the timeline and how many times you want this to bounce. So it's probably going to be a little bit farther at the beginning, and then the slower bounces will be a little closer together before it stops bouncing all the way. So let's go ahead and say maybe like 30. Actually, let's put it at about 20. And that's where we're going to hit the ground first. So let me just pull this down. And I'm actually going to look at this in our orthographic view so I can make sure that's our floor right there, so that it just touches the floor just like that. And then I'll set that keyframe. And then let's say, so that's the first bounce, and then we need another high frame. So maybe like 40. We'll lift this, maybe not quite as high as before. Something like that. Again, we're just eyeballing this right now and just guessing, and we're gonna go back and make adjustments to make it look better. So then I'll go maybe not quite as far, maybe like to 55. And we'll bring that down and put that right near the floor again. Did I go through the floor? I might have. Yeah, I did. Okay. So we'll just move that up just like that. And don't worry about the angle of the ball yet, because that's not going to affect anything we're doing right now. We'll worry about that later. But I'll key that there. And then we need another high frame, so maybe about 70. Lift it up a little bit lower like that. And then maybe to 80, 82, 83, something like that. We'll key that there. And then come down to maybe 95. Lift that up a little. And then 105, we can push it back down. Let's see what that's like. I'll key this really quick before I go on. Let's have a look at our graph editor and see what we have. And we're looking at the translate Y right now. I'm going to go ahead and hit A so it fills up the whole thing. So this is kind of what we're looking for. And maybe it'll only be about 3 bounces. That'll be fine too. At least like 3 to 5 bounces is what you're looking for here. So let's see what this actually looks like, because we know it's not going to be right just yet. But let's see where we are. Okay. So in terms of speed, it's probably good. We definitely have some floaty slidiness at the bottom that we can take care of. And we might need to make it roll a little longer before it stops. So let's first just look at the actual bounces. So we'll get my graph editor back up here. This definitely needs to be a sharper bounce. And I think with all these, I'm just going to break these right now. And that way we can just control them from one side to the other real easily. And I'll just lift these up. We'll make our little sharp V's for our bounces. Sometimes these are a little tricky to grab. It's probably good. Might want to adjust some of these and just make sure that between here and here that they're pretty evenly spaced. I think I didn't really do that before, but that's just something that we want to try to maybe take care of there. All right, let's see what that did. Okay. So I think what's happening is that our bounces might be a little bit too long, which means our keyframes are a little too far apart, and we might need to squish them together a little and maybe put in another jump in there. So that's easy enough to do. What I'll do is I'll come back up here in my graph editor, and I'll just start taking these and just sliding them a little bit this way. Actually, you know what? Let me just take all the keyframes just like that. And then I'll, whoops. Slide them a little closer. And then I'll take these a little closer. We'll worry about those top ones in a minute. Let's get these Sort of getting a little bit closer together here. And we'll even these out a little. Again, you want to try to make sure that your graph editor line looks good and smooth and even and a good pattern so that the rest of your movement is good too. So then we'll come down. That's our cursor right there. Let's go ahead and move this point. This is our high point that's sort of way out to the side there. Oops. And we'll just move that even with that. That's actually on like frame 75. And again, the actual numbers of the frames in this particular instance don't really matter. Sometimes it does. Sometimes you have to pay really close attention to the numbers of your keyframes, but that's not really the case right now. So right here, I think we need another low frame. So I'll go ahead and just take this, push it down like we did before. We'll look at the orthographic view. Set it right on the floor there. Key it. And now we've got another low keyframe right there. Need to make sure and break it. And then take this side and sort of lift it up and make it a little bit more of an arc. Maybe this one. Pull that down a little. You know, we might need another one sort of right in the center too. Let's come down a little farther. We'll lift this up just a tiny bit. Key that. And come down a little more. Push this back down. Just trying to add a couple more bounces in there so that our movement is a little bit better. And then I'm actually going to make this a little bit bigger so I can see my points a little better, my graph. Yeah, see there's a little bit of waviness right there that we don't want. So I'll go ahead and take this and sort of lift it like that. Probably need to break this one. And then do the same thing on this side. And now let's see what we have. So that's pretty believable right now. This is a little bit long right here. Still. And it's sort of an abrupt drop right there. So that's sort of in this area. So let's have a look right in there at our graph editor and see if we can do anything about that. That's the main thing that you guys need to sort of keep in mind, is that whenever you're doing these little tweaky adjustments and stuff, you do want to do it in the graph editor and not start setting a bunch of extra keyframes. Because if you start over keying your scene, see, I'm going to start to make like a little swooping kind of a line between all these top frames. If you start over keying your scene, your movement's going to get really choppy and really awkward looking and bad. So you just want to make sure, as much as you can, use as few keyframes as you can, and try to make sure that, what I might do is pull this out a little too. Make sure that you're doing most of your adjustments inside the graph editor. This one might need to be sort of widened out a little as well. Let's see what that did. I'll look at it one more time. I think it might need one more tiny bounce at the end. Again, because we're trying to just make this one as realistic as we can in terms of just the physics of it. But let me go ahead and just right at the very end, lift it up a tiniest little bit. key it. And then go down just a little bit more. I'm just going to get to where I can see. Push this back down onto the floor. Key it again. And then we'll zoom in real close again. Break these. I think that's already broken, so we can just lift that up a little. Break this one. So make a little curve there. And then with this one, whoops, we just make sure that that's nice and flat, because this is that roll to a stop that we were talking about. So let's see what that looks like. I'm pretty happy with that. I think it's sliding a little at the end. So what I'll do to fix that is go back up in my graph editor, and with my Translate Z selected, I'm just going to take this last keyframe and just slide it in a little. Just a little. Or maybe take it out a little farther. Yeah, take it out a little farther. Just like that. Let's see what that does. Yeah, I think that made the sliding worse. So I don't know why I keep closing that. Should probably just leave that open and not close it at all. And it's going to be on my Translate Z. I'll take this and move it, make it down at the end here so I can see. Push that in a little. Let's see what that looks like. All right, that's kind of pretty naturally rolling to a stop there. So that's sort of what we need for that. That'll be good. Let's go ahead and stop this and save. I'm going to save right into my scenes folder. This is going to be called Bouncing Ball Test 2. All right, so we have basically our movement down. So now all we have to do is the squash and stretch. So, and for that, again, we're going to need our squash and stretch handle. I'm just going to go ahead and focus on the ball here really quick. And that's in the same place. Go into your modeling, deform, nonlinear, squash. And then you want to make sure that you shift select the ball and parent to the ball, because you want to make sure that that squash handle follows you with the ball. Otherwise, it's just going to stay right here and squash and stretch up and down, and the ball is going to go out of its influence and it's not going to do anything for you. So, with our squash handle put in, let's go back into our graph editor and let's have a look at our Translate Y. I'm pressing A so that I can see all of my keyframes. A means all, you can remember it that way. And remember that on all of our high frames, we don't want any squash and stretch at all. We need the squash factor to be set to 0 because we don't want to have anything like that. We just need to have no squash and no stretch on our squash factor on all of our high frames. Now this is a point where you might need to go back and write down what your high frames actually are. So I'm just going to pause right now and go do that because, you know, we were just putting in keyframes and making sure that they looked right. But now we definitely need to know for sure what they are and go ahead and write that. Okay, so I've got my keyframes all written down, and yours might be different because you might not have, you know, set everything on exactly the same keyframes as I have, but I've written my high and low frames down now, so I have them to refer to. So I'm going to start out at the first high frame, which is frame 1, and with my squash factor, with my squash handle selected, I'm going to go find my squash factor. I'm just going to squish this up so it's not in the way. And the squash factor is going to be set to 0. We're first going to do the high frames so that, because, you know, all the high frames have to just be not squashed at all. My next high frame is 31. So you can find it by scrolling along here. You can also just type it in this box right here. Just type 31 and it'll take you right to that keyframe. And then I'll go ahead and key that. My next one is going to be 55. And I'll key my squash factor at 0 there. The next one is going to be 74. And then 88. And then 96. All right, and then we'll have to do the squash on the low frames. Now, one thing that you're going to notice is that, and let me just show you right here, is that squash handle is rotating with the ball. So what's happening is that on some of these low frames, the squash handle is not in the right position. So we are going to have to set some keyframes on the rotate X of our squash handle as well. And probably the translate X as well. We'll look at that in a second and we'll see. But let's just do, because before we can figure out how much to squash these, we have to make sure that the squash handle is faced in the right direction. If I were to try, this is one of my first low frames, this number 17. If I were to try to squash this, you see how it's squashing in a weird sideways kind of a way. That's not what we want. So what we've got to do then is to just set some keyframes on the rotate X of our squash handle. So, and then at the top on the high frames, it doesn't really matter because again, it's not squashed. That doesn't make a difference. So it might later on if we start to get some weird spinning, but we can work with that at that time. So let me just go ahead and find my first low frame, which is number 17. And what I can do is look at this in the orthographic view and rotate this in the x-axis. Oops. You can actually just highlight this and use the middle mouse button and scroll it too so that it rotates. And just make sure that it rotates straight up and down, as close as you can get it. That's probably good. And just key that right there. And then this is a situation where like this is going to change every time because we've already got a lot of keyframes in. So you're not going to be able to sort of cut and paste this down all of your low frames because it is going to be a different value for every low frame. You just have to come back up to the next one, which is going to be 44. Let me zoom back into my ball here. Take that and just rotate that back up, straight up and down again. Because again, these are our low frames. We want it to be completely vertical so it squashes against the ground. Next one's going to be 65. I'm highlighting the viewport and hitting F so we can see it again. And then rotating that so that it's vertical. There we go. 74. Wait, you know what? I'm on the wrong list. I've gotten onto the wrong list. What am I here? It's 65. It's 83. It's not 74. Okay, so let me not go to frame 74. Let me go to 83. That's my next low frame. That's real easy to do, guys, to sort of lose track of where you are. And you're probably going to have to rekey some stuff because you have messed up something like that. It's just part of the deal. It's something that you have to just be aware of and try and work around and do the best you can. And don't get too frustrated if you have to go key something over because you got off or you got on the wrong list or something, because it happens. I'm at 93 right now. And then going to 99. And then I have another low frame at 105, but this is already where it needs to be, so that's all that matters. So now what we need to do is go back and start working with our squash again. Go back up to the beginning, and let's just make sure, let's just see what we have. Let's just play it and see what we have. Right, so every time now that ball hits the ground, that squash handle is in the right place. So, and then at the end, where it's not really rolling very much, it kind of just stays like that. And that's probably fine. If that ends up being a problem, we'll just deal with it then. It might be something that we get something weird going on, but we'll just have to see. So now we're doing the squash on our low frames. So let me select the squash handle again, and now we're going to be working with the factor. So we've already got the factor set for all of our high ones. Let's do the low ones now. Let's go up to frame 17. And let's go ahead, and this is actually going to squash kind of a lot. So, because this one is a really hard bounce from really far up in the air. So I'll squash it out kind of a lot right there. And then the next one's going to be 44. That's going to be maybe not quite as squashed, whoops, but pretty squashed still. It's hard to get a hold of that. Let me see if I can. There we go. Squash that out there. And then the next frame is going to be 65. And you can actually even just do this the same way too. You can squash it just a little. And key that. And then we're on 65. We can go to 83. And then this is where it's starting to roll. So there's going to be hardly any squash at all on these. Just the tiniest little squish. Just a little bit. Right, now let's just have a look at that and see what happens. Right, so that's probably going to be okay for now. I mean, it's not right yet because we don't have our stretch in yet. But in terms of sort of how much is squashing on the low frames, it's probably going to be okay. So let's go back now and let's start doing the stretches. I remember that those are on each side of our low frames. So let's go ahead and go down to 17. And we will take this little button right here, which just steps back one frame. And we'll hit that, let's say on these long ones, probably about 3 times. So I'll hit that 3 times. So we're sort of 3 frames back from that low frame. And I'm going to take my squash factor and I'm going to just stretch it kind of a lot, kind of maybe about that much. And we can go back and again adjust this if we need to. I'll key that. Jump to the next frame, and then do with this one, jump forward 3 frames. 1, 2, 3. We'll take our stretch factor and stretch it probably about the same amount. Something like that. And then our next low frame is 44. So we'll back up 3 from there. And take our stretch, and we'll just stretch it maybe about that much. Key that there. What I'm kind of doing is I'm looking at sort of how wide the stretch is and making the squashes and then making the stretch a similar width. That's what I'm doing just in my head, trying to figure out how wide to make these. And then, you know, if we need to work with it later, then we can. But probably about that much. And then our next low frame is going to be 65. And this is starting to get sort of not very much stretch anymore. And also we start to maybe need to bring in our keyframes a little closer. So I'm going to only back up 2 this time instead of 3. Take my squash factor and stretch it just a little like that. We'll jump to this keyframe and go forward 2 more and do the same. Maybe about that much. And then the next low frame is 83. So yeah, hardly any stretch there at all. We'll back up 2. Just a tiniest little, just a little bit oblong that way. Just off of round. That's what we're looking for there. And then go forward 2 more. And this really, like, barely any stretch we need on this. Yeah, maybe not even that much. We'll see. And then 93 is when we're not really having any stretch really at all. So let's see what that looks like. We're starting out here again. Let's actually, I'm going to select my squash handle and hide it with Control H. And we'll just see what this looks like. So it's a little wobbly looking. And what's happening is that it's starting to stretch really early. And it's just a little bit wobbly, like a Jell-O ball at the end. And that's just because our stretches are lasting too long. They're starting too soon and they're lasting too long. So that's an easy fix too. We can go back to our low frames again. I'm going to hit Control Shift H and bring back my stretch handle here. And let's go back to 17. And we're going to be working with our stretch factor again. And this is our stretch. So what we'll do is we will just back up a couple frames before that and set the factor back to 0. And I'll key that. And if I just show you here, what happens, the ball is round and then it stretches and then squashes. And that's really what should happen anyway. So that's what we'll do. We'll just go back up to this stretch frame here. We'll jump forward a couple frames. Set the factor back to 0 so that it goes back to normal. And then that's what we want. So the stretch, squash, stretch, back to normal, up to the top again. So then here's our next little stretch. Back up 2. Key this back to 0. Here's our stretch on the other side. Jump forward 2. Key the factor back to 0. And then the next low frame is going to be 65. So there's our next stretch. And this one, yeah, we'll jump back to again. Maybe not even that far, maybe just one on these because it's getting really close right now. Now we'd probably go with 2. We'll see if we need to change it later. And then here's this stretch on the other side. Jump forward 2. Set this back to 0. Key this. And then we've got 83. And this one, I definitely think we really only need to go back 1 frame. And key this back to 0. And then the same thing on the other side. This one will just jump forward 1 frame. And it's already actually set to 0, so because I think we didn't really change it on this one. Well, that might be a high frame actually. Yeah, we'll just go 1 forward. We're here on 85. The low frame is 83. That's the stretch frame. We'll jump forward 1 more to 86. Set this to 0 at the factor and key it. And now let's see what this looks like. All right, let's look at it without seeing the squash handle. So it's looking better. There's something weird going on right there. I think those squashes right there are those stretches. They're too big. That's what's going on right there because it's making it look weird and wobbly. So I think those stretches need to be less. It's set to 0.107. I'm going to set it to 0.05. And then the stretch on the other side, it's pretty close, 0.13. I'm going to set it to 0.05 as well. All right, so let's see what that looks like. I'll hide that. Okay, let me look at this first part again. So sort of right around here. I feel like that's too much squash and stretch altogether. So I'm just going to take all of this and just reel it in a little. I'm going to take my squash factor, bring that down a little. Take this squash and just bring it back up a bit. Not too much, just a little. And take this one and bring that back down a bit. All right. Let's see if that looks better. And this, at this point, we've got all the keyframes I think that we need. It's just tweaking at this point. Trying to make it look as realistic as possible. And I think I need to do a similar thing here with this squash and stretch. It's just a little bit much. So I'll just come in and just dial that back a little. right, let's look at that without our squash handle and see what it looks like. All right. So now the only thing I'm seeing, and this is real nitpicky, but this is kind of what you have to do to be an animator. This is hanging in the air a little long. I think a way that I will sort of get that to look better is, let me just select my ball here. Here are all the keyframes that we set in our graph editor on our squash handle. We'll just have a look at that just so you can see what it looks like. That's all of our squash and stretch stuff. The other thing that you can do is just come in here and just start making these kind of adjustments. Just come in and just move this down a little. Maybe move this one down a little. Move this one up. So they kind of look a little more even. And again, sort of trying to make a pattern. See what that looks like. So that looks pretty good on the squash and stretch. This one part's still hanging in the air too long for me though. So I'm going to select that and look in my graph editor. And in my translate Y, I think that what I'll do is just take this and I'm going to lift this up a little and make it just bounce a little higher. So it sort of takes up a little more of that time by getting more height. And I think that looks a lot better. And then it just rolls to a stop. So that is the second bouncing ball. So what I'll do now is I'll do a play blast. Make sure that you have it set to AVI, quality's all the way up, the scale's all the way up, save to file is checked on. Click browse, it's going to go right into your movies folder. I'm going to call this test 2. You probably need to call yours bouncing ball 2. Let me just call it that. And play blast it. Sometimes the play blasting takes a while because it's got to just go through and calculate everything depending on how fast your computer is. If you're on one of the really old computers, it might take a while. Right, so that looks like it's probably done. And let's see where it is. There we go. And this is taking a little bit longer to play than I would like. And actually it didn't work at all. But anyway, the video's there. I can play it in another player and that'll be fine. So that's what you're going to turn in. And so you've definitely done animation on 2 different types of bouncing balls. You've got the one jumping in the middle, and then you've got this one that bounces and rolls to a stop. And then another video, we are going to talk about how to render those sequences so you can get the lighting and any kind of like surfacing like that you've worked on. So that'll be in another video. Thanks. And go ahead and write that